There's something about humiliation that doesn't quite leave you, even when you think you've grown past it. It embeds itself into the soft tissue of memory, carving out a space so deep and sharp that years later, it still aches when touched. That's what happened to me. Not in a grand, cinematic moment where someone poured wine over my head or punched me in the face at graduation. No, it happened with a single word, one said loudly enough in a crowded room to redefine who I was, at least for a while. She called me a loser. Her voice cut through the air with a cruel elegance, the kind only certain people seem born with, the kind that turns ridicule into performance. And for a moment, the entire room turned their eyes on me, and I shrank. I didn't respond. I didn't storm out or defend myself. I just stood there like an artifact no one wanted, clumsy and out of place. I didn't grow up with much. My clothes were hand-me-downs from thrift stores, the kind that smelled like other people's stories. I wore the same scuffed sneakers for 4 years. I studied with borrowed textbooks and used outdated software on an old laptop that whirred like an exhausted fan, but I never really cared. I had something else, a hunger, not for validation or wealth, but for building. I liked watching things come to life from code. I was invisible to most people in college. I wasn't the life of the party or the guy everyone turned to in group projects. I was just Jason Turner, the quiet one, always typing in the back of the classroom, probably weird. The only attention I ever received came from a girl named Vanessa. She was loud, beautiful, and belonged to the world in a way I didn't. She dated guys who played guitar and wore leather jackets. I fell for her anyway, the way a moth falls for fire. For a while, she let me orbit her world. I tutored her in one of our programming classes, and she laughed at my jokes, at least when no one else was around. I thought it meant something. I thought I was special. But the night of her birthday party, that was the night she reminded me of where I stood. Everyone was there, shoulder to shoulder in a rented house that pulsed with cheap beer and bass-heavy music. Someone had dared her to kiss the smartest loser in the room, and she turned to me with a grin I didn't understand at first. When I smiled back, the room erupted in laughter, and she said the word. Loser. Not whispered, not ironic, just sharp and final, like a gavel striking wood. People laughed. I remember the laughter more than the faces. That sound has its own kind of texture, warm and distant, yet suffocating when you realize it's about you. I left quietly, even thanked her parents for the party on the way out. I remember walking down the street alone, feeling colder than the October wind deserved. That night I didn't sleep. I opened my laptop and began typing. Not because I had something to prove, but because I needed to remember who I was when no one else was watching. I started sketching out the early frameworks of a project I'd been thinking about. A self-learning AI system that could optimize workflows for small businesses. The next morning, I skipped class. I worked until my fingers were sore and my screen was a tangle of variables, functions, and half-broken loops. I was tired, but not in the way you are when you waste time. I felt alive. That project became my obsession. While others applied for internships at big-name firms and added trendy buzzwords to their LinkedIn profiles, I just built. Nights blurred into days. My friends, what few I had, stopped calling. I didn't blame them. After graduation, reality hit like a train. Student loans, rent, rejection emails that began with unfortunately. I took the only job I could find, junior developer at a small logistics startup. The pay barely covered groceries and the work was mindless. But I kept my project alive. Every night I came home, ate instant noodles, and typed until my eyes ached. I couldn't let it die. It was the only thing that reminded me I was more than what she said. My apartment was a shoebox. The walls were thin and the radiator hissed like it was angry to be alive. But it was mine. I covered the window with code printouts and sketched algorithms on the whiteboard I found in the trash outside a tutoring center. I tested. I broke it. I rebuilt. I failed. I debugged. And slowly, line by line, the thing started to work. By year 2, I had a prototype that could integrate with basic business management software. I pitched it to 10 different small business owners. 9 said no. The 10th, a tired man who ran a bakery and couldn't figure out his inventory system, said yes. That was all I needed. The system optimized his stock orders, cut waste by 40%, and saved him 3 hours a week. He referred me to another local shop, then another. I didn't sleep much those days, but I finally felt like something was moving, like I was no longer treading water in place. I left my day job. I took a loan from a friend and registered my business, Nova Systems. It sounded bigger than it was. At first, I operated out of my apartment. My dining table was my desk. My coffee mug was always half full of something I forgot to finish. But I had 3 clients, then 10, then 20. I hired 2 contractors, people I met through online developer forums. We worked remotely, stitched together by Slack messages and caffeine. It wasn't glamorous, but the product worked. Word spread. By the time year 3 ended, I had 80 clients and a pitch meeting with a venture capital firm. They didn't laugh at me. They didn't call me a loser. They offered $500,000 in seed funding. I signed the deal with hands that still trembled from years of rejection. I moved out of my apartment into a small office with glass walls and a lock that clicked cleanly into place. I bought new clothes, not to impress, but to feel the difference. I still carried the old insult like a scar, but it no longer stung. It reminded me where I began. It reminded me to build quietly but burn steadily. That's the funny thing about being called a loser. If you let it, it becomes a prophecy. But if you fight it, not with anger but with intention, it becomes fuel. And I had enough fuel to light a city. Now, when I passed mirrors, I didn't look away. I didn't see the boy who got laughed at in someone else's kitchen. I saw a man who had built something no one could take from him. But deep down, I wondered, if she ever saw me again, would she recognize the person she had once humiliated? I didn't know then that I would get my answer. Success doesn't announce itself with confetti and fanfare. It comes quietly, first as the absence of panic when the bills arrive, then as the ability to choose. Choose how you spend your time, where you eat, what you wear. But more than anything, success gives you the power to say no and to mean it. That was the first real change I noticed. People used to say no to me. Now I was the one deciding, and yet I didn't feel triumphant. After the funding came in, things changed fast. I hired a small team, moved operations into a modest office space with exposed brick and fluorescent lights that hummed louder than I liked. But it was ours. We painted one of the walls a bright cobalt blue and filled it with sticky notes, ideas, bugs, questions, and half-jokes that only coders would find funny. Every morning I walked in before anyone else, touched that wall, and reminded myself what I was building. We weren't just writing software. We were offering order in chaos. Small businesses were drowning in tools they didn't understand. My platform, streamlined, AI-powered, intuitive, gave them relief. Owners who once tracked orders on paper now had real-time dashboards. I watched the weight lift off their shoulders, and that gave me more satisfaction than any bank statement could. But with growth came pressure. Meetings replaced code. Strategy replaced instinct. I learned how to navigate investor calls, media pitches, and late-night budgeting marathons. I wore button-down shirts instead of faded hoodies. I kept my hair trimmed, my voice even. People started calling me sir, and I still flinched every time. In those early days, I felt like a man borrowing someone else's suit. I'd smile at boardroom tables and wonder if they could tell I once cried in a corner of a party while kids laughed at me. But no one asked. People only see the result, not the road. And I didn't volunteer the details. I let them assume I was always this composed, always this sure of myself. My name began appearing in startup blogs and local business panels. One article called me the quiet architect of the new wave. I read that sentence over and over, trying to see the version of myself they described. Quiet, yes, architect maybe, but new wave. I was still working 18 hours a day, still fighting bugs at 3 a.m., still haunted by failure's shadow trailing behind success's spotlight. Despite that, something undeniable was happening. Nova Systems crossed 100 paying clients. Our software integrated with over a dozen major platforms. We launched a mobile version. A mid-sized logistics firm signed a 3-year contract, and suddenly we had revenue in the 7 figures. I stood in my office after that deal alone, staring at the screen. The numbers looked fake. I'd spent so long scraping together enough to buy instant coffee that seeing 6 zeros made me nauseous. And yet I didn't celebrate. I didn't take a vacation. I didn't buy a new car. I reinvested every dime. I expanded the dev team, brought in UX designers, hired an operations lead who used to work at Amazon. Each decision stretched me thinner, made me a little less like the kid who just wanted to build. But I knew what I was doing. I wasn't running a startup anymore. I was building a company, a legacy. Then came the new building. It wasn't intentional at first. We were just running out of space. I visited a dozen locations, soulless boxes with gray carpet and ticking fluorescent lights. But then I saw it, an old manufacturing space in the city center, all steel bones and glass panels. It had been vacant for years, dust hung in the sunlight like old memories, but I saw it instantly, our future. I bought the building through a holding company, afraid that if I showed up with my name, someone would laugh again. But no one laughed. The paperwork went through. Renovations began. Within 6 months, Nova Systems had a new home, 4 floors of open space, natural light, quiet rooms for deep work, and a coffee bar that served more than instant sludge. We had made it. Employees started arriving in waves, first 20, then 50, then close to 100. The office buzzed like a brain on fire. Desks filled with dual monitors, engineers scribbled equations on the glass walls, interns stumbled through their first weeks, eyes wide. I walked the halls silently, letting them have their world. I didn't need to be the loudest voice. I just needed to keep it running. That's when the past began to creep in. It started with a message from HR. A batch of new applications for our marketing expansion, one of them marked with a small asterisk. I almost skipped it, but something about the name pulled me back. Vanessa Williams. The screen blurred for a moment, not because of the name, but because of everything it unlocked. The smell of that party, the way her voice cut through the music, the shame I'd swallowed like a pill that never dissolved. It all came rushing back. She had applied for a job at my company. I clicked the resume. She'd graduated the same year I did, though I already knew that. She de-worked at 2 agencies, both mid-tier. One had closed. The other had let her go during budget cuts. Her portfolio was clean, competent, unremarkable. She had included a cover letter, generic, templated, polite. There was no mention of me. No hint that she recognized the name of the CEO. I doubted she even remembered what she said. For her, it was probably just a drunken joke, a throwaway insult tossed into a crowded room and forgotten the next morning. But for me, it had been a cornerstone, not of vengeance, not of hate, but of clarity. That night taught me who I never wanted to become. It sharpened me. It made me work harder, think deeper, endure longer. I stared at the screen for a long time, not because I wanted revenge, not because I felt anger, but because I felt nothing. That surprised me more than anything. I wasn't burning with resentment. I wasn't eager to humiliate her in return. I had outgrown that room, that party, that label. The scar was still there, but it was healed. Still, I couldn't ignore the poetry of it. The girl who once called me a loser had unknowingly asked me for a job. It felt like a closed loop, a chapter ready to be rewritten, not by changing the past, but by choosing how I responded to it. I could have rejected the application without a second thought. I could have forwarded it to HR with a note and a smirk, but I didn't. I flagged it. I set up a meeting. I cleared an hour on my schedule. I wanted to see her again, not to prove anything, not to gloat. I needed to look her in the eyes and see if the world had humbled her the way it had sharpened me, not for closure, for understanding. Because the truth was, I didn't want to be remembered as the boy she humiliated. I wanted to know who she had become. And maybe, just maybe, I wanted her to see who I had become too. There's a strange stillness that precedes confrontation, not the kind born of conflict, but the quieter, more intimate reckoning that comes when 2 timelines converge after having violently separated. I felt that stillness the morning she was scheduled to come in. Vanessa Williams. The name echoed like a soft drumbeat through my otherwise ordered routine. When I stood in front of the mirror before leaving home, I didn't see the polished man the world assumed I'd become. I saw both versions of myself in that reflection, the boy at the party and the man in the tower. The former still hunched inside my chest, a little quieter now, but never truly gone. I didn't resent him. I pitied him sometimes. I admired him too. He had survived, after all. He had kept walking when everything around him had told him to sit down and shut up. I took the elevator up to the top floor and settled into my office. The skyline was beginning to blush with the light of the rising sun. A gentle orange painted the horizon, broken only by the jutting silhouettes of steel and glass. It was beautiful in the way hard-won things are beautiful, not soft, but earned. At 9:00 a.m. sharp, I received a notification. She had arrived. I had reviewed her resume again that morning, not out of necessity, but to ground myself. It was clean, neat, professional, much like the version of her I remembered when she wanted to impress professors. But resumes never tell the whole story. I wondered how many rejections she had received recently. I wondered what her life had looked like after college. Had she floated easily through social ladders, or had she fallen off a few along the way? I had no desire to shame her. I didn't want vindication. I wanted context, understanding, a kind of symmetry, maybe. The HR assistant brought her to the waiting area, and I watched her through the glass wall of my office. She looked different, not drastically, not jarringly, but time had reshaped her. She still had that posture of someone who believed, at least outwardly, that they belonged anywhere. But her eyes moved differently. Less certainty, more calculation. It was the way people scan a room when they're not sure how much space they're allowed to take up. She wore a navy blouse tucked into a pair of tailored slacks, polished shoes, no wedding ring. She clutched a leather folder with the precision of someone trying to make a good impression. I studied her as I had once studied code, searching for breaks, inconsistencies, unexpected patterns. And yet, despite everything, I didn't feel the rush of superiority I had once imagined I might if this moment ever came. I felt human, curious, and slightly melancholic. Because no matter how the meeting would go, the fact remained. We were once young and cruel to each other in uneven measure. I stood, walked slowly to the door, and opened it. She rose immediately when she saw me, and I saw the flicker, the moment her eyes caught my face, then my name on the wall, and stitched the two together. It was subtle but unmistakable. Recognition often brings with it a quiet, involuntary gasp, even if no sound escapes the mouth. She hadn't known, that much was clear. She had walked into this building, into my company, not knowing she was walking toward the very person she had ridiculed years ago. That somehow made the moment cleaner, unbiased. I led her into the office, offered her a seat, then returned to my side of the desk. She sat upright but not rigid. She appeared professional, controlled, perhaps rehearsed. I could see the calculation in her posture, the silent mental notes she was taking on everything, the layout of the room, the way the furniture was arranged, the books on my shelf. She was still sharp. I had reviewed countless candidates in the past 3 years. I'd developed an instinct for posture, for tone, for the slight changes in demeanor that revealed more than resumes ever could. With her, it was like reading a book I had once tried to burn but had kept in the attic anyway. I took in the details without speaking. The way she adjusted her bracelet twice in 30 seconds, the way she blinked slightly more often than normal but still held eye contact. These were not the habits of someone relaxed. These were tells, little vulnerabilities wrapped in protocol. My mind drifted backward in time, even as I sat in that glass office. I remembered her laughter at that party, how she'd thrown her head back with theatrical amusement while I stood frozen, fingers clenched around a solo cup, face burning with shame. I remembered how I'd walked the length of campus at midnight, unable to feel my legs, only the ringing in my ears. I remembered staring up at my ceiling that night, unable to cry because the pain felt too old, too familiar, too quietly violent. But I also remembered the morning after, when I'd sat cross-legged on the floor with my laptop and typed the first line of what would become the foundation of this company. She had unknowingly marked the beginning of something great, not because she had offered insight or fuel, but because I had turned pain into purpose. Pain is an underrated engine. It doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers every morning in the form of a question, "And what now?" And every day you get to answer it. I watched Vanessa across the desk, aware of how fragile this moment could be if I mishandled it. I could have leveraged the power imbalance, cornered her with the memory, demanded apology, made her feel what I had felt. But that would make me small, and I had spent too long growing away from smallness. Instead, I listened to her professional summary. I listened to the rehearsed lines about her passion for digital strategy and market growth. I listened as she detailed her years at the agency, her campaigns, her results. She spoke like someone trying to outrun a shadow, concise, confident, but driven by something unspoken. And in all of it, I saw a woman who had once felt bulletproof, but had since been dented by life's sharper corners. That realization brought no pleasure, only clarity. I began to review her materials with a discerning but neutral eye. She had talent, not exceptional but steady, reliable. Her portfolio reflected that. She had pivoted with trends, adapted to client needs, and carried herself well. She would fit the role on paper, certainly. But whether she would fit here in this culture of resilience and humility, that remained the question. Still, something else tugged at me, a faint ache of nostalgia, not for her, but for who we had been in that old life. We were children playing with adult tools, laughter, cruelty, affection, dismissal. We hadn't known what anything meant. We just threw words like stones and watched for the ripples. But the lake was me, and some ripples never stopped moving. I considered how strange it was that a moment so casual for her could be a crucible for me. That kind of asymmetry can distort a person. It can turn memory into obsession, or worse, into a script you replay endlessly. But I had rewritten the script, line by line, and now she was sitting inside it. At the end of the meeting, I walked her to the exit. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to. There was something deeply human about offering that dignity. I didn't extend familiarity. I didn't let emotion leak into professionalism. I simply allowed the moment to remain untainted by revenge. She thanked me, her voice measured, her eyes guarded but not cold. As she walked away, her heels clicking softly on the polished floor, I stood still, watching as the past exited through glass doors into a future it hadn't imagined. Back in my office, I sat down slowly. The city outside buzzed with its usual chaos. Inside, all was still. I thought of how strange life was, how it loops and folds, how the same names return like refrains in songs we thought we'd stopped singing. I had no certainty about whether I would hire her. That would depend on the team's evaluation, her follow-ups, and her alignment with our evolving vision. But I knew one thing. I no longer needed to be angry. And that was more powerful than any title. There was a different kind of silence in the building, the kind that wasn't empty but expectant, like the air had memorized what had passed and was quietly processing it. I moved through the office with my coffee in hand, avoiding the elevator and climbing the stairs instead, one floor at a time. I've always believed that the act of walking slows your thoughts down to the speed of reflection, and I needed to reflect. When I entered the main floor, the sun had begun its quiet intrusion through the east-facing windows, casting long amber bars across the meeting tables and open desks. The office was empty, but not still. You could always feel the residue of energy left behind, screens on standby, whiteboards half erased, chairs slightly misaligned like the ghosts of yesterday's urgency had momentarily paused and forgotten to tidy up. I found that comforting. I sat at my desk, pulled up the list of candidates, and stared at her name. It was just a name, 8 letters, 2 syllables, written in the same black font as the others. It didn't deserve to mean more, and yet I couldn't pretend it didn't. My body remembered it even when my mind tried to be clinical. I had learned how to compartmentalize over the years. I'd faced board members who doubted my metrics, journalists who misunderstood my mission, even developers who questioned my every decision. None of that had ever made me feel like that one moment from college still could. It wasn't even the word she used that lingered. It was the laughter, the unity of it, a room of strangers agreeing in a single breath that I wasn't enough. Now the tables had turned, only I didn't feel triumphant, I felt responsible. I opened her evaluation file. The hiring panel had left notes. Her performance was solid, not extraordinary but competent. She spoke with clarity, asked relevant questions, and handled pressure well. The marketing director liked her energy. The brand strategist said she had potential. I trusted my team. I built this company not as a vanity project, but as a space for people better than me in their craft to thrive. And yet I hesitated. Not because I couldn't let go of the past, but because I was afraid of inviting it back into the room. I closed the file and leaned back, letting the ceiling take my gaze. I remembered what it felt like to be on the other side of interviews, smiling through nerves, rehearsing elevator pitches in the bathroom mirror, trying not to sound desperate but still hoping they'd say yes. She hadn't been desperate, but there had been something in her body language, tightened shoulders, and extra breath before answering a question that suggested vulnerability. Life has a way of sanding down even the most polished exteriors, and maybe that's what I had witnessed. Maybe she'd grown. Maybe she'd faced her own long nights, her own internal reckonings, or maybe she was just looking for a paycheck. I wouldn't know until I gave her the chance. I got up, walked to the glass wall, and looked down at the city. Below me were the streets I used to walk while my pockets held nothing but keys and bus tickets. I'd eaten from food trucks and mapped out algorithms in notebooks while waiting in laundromats. None of that showed on the face I wore now, but I remembered it all, and I never wanted to become the kind of man who forgot. Hiring her would be risky, not professionally but emotionally, because it meant letting a part of the past step into the present, not in memory but in flesh and routine. She would be in meetings, in brainstorming sessions, in the hallway outside my office. Her voice would become part of the daily hum of my environment. I would no longer be able to place her neatly in a chapter already written. She would become active text again. Was I ready for that? The rest of the day passed in fragments, meetings, emails, and progress updates, but my thoughts kept orbiting back to her. Not to the girl she had been, but to the woman who had sat across from me the day before, who had tried to mask her recognition with professional restraint. There had been a flicker, brief, unspoken, but undeniable. She had known who I was, and she had carried that knowledge with a quiet weight. That evening, long after most of the office had emptied, I sat in the quiet hum of my top-floor space and made my decision. I would let the team decide. If they voted in favor, I wouldn't veto it. I wouldn't interfere. I had built this company on trust, on shared judgment. If I stepped in now, I'd be giving power to my insecurity, not my integrity. And worse, I'd be teaching myself that my past defined others' futures. I never wanted to be that kind of leader. So I emailed the hiring manager and told him to proceed with whoever the panel selected. I deleted her name from my internal shortlist and left the rest to unfold without my hand pressing the scale. Weeks passed. Her name faded from daily operations. New hires joined. Projects launched. Life resumed its rhythmic hum, and soon her interview became just another entry in a digital archive. I didn't revisit it. I didn't mention it, but a part of me remained alert. Then one Monday morning, I saw her. She wasn't in my office. She wasn't at my desk. She was simply there, walking past the design team's open bay, carrying a cup of coffee, flipping through a printout, nodding politely at someone as she entered the meeting pod on the West Wing. So she had been hired. I hadn't been notified directly, and I hadn't asked. But there she was, moving through the ecosystem I had built, her presence no longer hypothetical. I watched from a distance, unnoticed, and tried to parse the emotion that surfaced. It wasn't regret, nor was it resentment. It was closer to caution, a deep awareness that I was watching the past reconstitute itself inside my present. But there was no collision, no implosion, just two truths existing side by side. Over the following days, I saw her more, in morning huddles, in lunch queues, in strategy meetings. She carried herself with professionalism, spoke with insight, and kept a quiet perimeter around herself. She didn't seek me out. She didn't linger near my office. She operated like any other team member. That perhaps was what surprised me most. She wasn't trying to be noticed, not by me, not by anyone. I asked for an anonymous peer review of her early performance. It came back positive. She was responsive, curious, respectful, and collaborative. The marketing team liked her. The junior designers appreciated her mentorship. She had even volunteered to take over a difficult client brief that others had quietly avoided. It wasn't what I had expected, and that taught me something about my expectations. I had assumed the worst, even after everything I claimed to have learned about grace and growth. A part of me had wanted her to fail, not out of cruelty, but for validation, as if her failure would confirm that I had been right all along. But that instinct was my weakness, not hers. She wasn't here to settle a score. She was here to do a job. And maybe that meant I had finally healed enough to let her. That evening, as I sat once more in the glow of my quiet office, I opened a document I hadn't touched in years. It was the first line of code I'd written after the party, the beginning of the platform that started it all. It was messy, primitive, and full of bugs, but it was honest. It was who I had been. I smiled, because now, in the same building born from that moment of hurt, the person who caused it was working to build something better alongside me. Not against me, not beneath me, beside me. And that perhaps was the truest definition of peace. Weeks passed like pages flipping in a book that knew its rhythm well. The company thrived, momentum carried us forward, and like always, each day dissolved into the next. A careful blend of deadlines, progress metrics, internal reviews, and quiet personal reckonings that never quite left the room, no matter how successful we appeared on the surface. I watched her from a distance, not obsessively, not constantly, but with the kind of discreet awareness that comes when the past walks beside you, dressed as someone new. Vanessa moved through our ecosystem not as an intruder, but as a natural part of the organism, offering thoughtful suggestions in marketing huddles, taking initiative during campaign breakdowns, and slowly, steadily earning the trust of those who had never known the version of her that once wounded me. I hadn't spoken to her since the interview. I had no reason to. Our company structure was wide enough that executive oversight seldom dipped into middle-tier strategy meetings. Still, that silence wasn't empty. It was loaded. Each time I saw her in the hallway or passed her name in a report, I felt the low-frequency hum of history trying to rise from its quiet grave. There came a morning, a Tuesday, I think, when our paths finally crossed in a way that could no longer remain distant. A client crisis had escalated. One of our enterprise partners had launched a campaign without proper segmentation filters, and their conversion metrics had tanked. Worse, they were threatening to pull their contract unless we rebuilt the strategy within 72 hours. Our head of accounts pulled together a cross-departmental response team, and Vanessa's name was on the list. So was mine. I walked into the conference room later than usual that day, having taken a call from one of our European investors. By the time I entered, the team had already gathered. 8 people. 2 strategists, 1 lead developer, 1 data analyst, 2 operations liaisons, and Vanessa sitting on the far side of the oval table, notebook open, pen in hand, looking focused and composed. She didn't flinch when I entered. Her eyes lifted briefly, acknowledged me with the calm professionalism of someone unshaken by history, and returned to the briefing document in front of her. I couldn't tell if it was strength or detachment, but either way, it was effective. She had drawn no attention to our past, and for that I was grateful. I sat, listened, contributed. The meeting unfolded with clinical urgency. Everyone stayed on point. Vanessa's ideas were sharp. She spoke in bullet points, proposed 1 concrete pivot to the messaging strategy, and offered to lead a fast turnaround creative review with the copy team. Her confidence was intact, but no longer theatrical. She had learned, somewhere along the way, the value of weight without volume. Still, as she spoke, something stirred in me. It wasn't resentment. It wasn't pride either. It was a kind of estranged familiarity, like hearing a song you once danced to in a different life and realizing the tempo has changed, but the melody is still there. After the meeting, I remained seated for a moment longer, long enough to notice the way the chairs shifted as people exited, the way the whiteboard carried fragments of plans already half erased. Vanessa had left the room without a glance back. Her footsteps were quiet, intentional. I looked at her seat after she left. The notebook she'd been scribbling in was gone, but a pen she'd used remained on the table unclaimed. I didn't touch it. I simply observed it, an artifact of presence, nothing more. That evening I stayed late. The office by then was nearly empty. A few lights still burned on the second floor, where a team of junior developers was debugging an update before release. But on the executive floor, all was still. I moved through the halls with slow steps, letting the stillness press against me like water in a deep pool. I found myself pausing in front of the mirrored panel in the hallway leading to the library. It wasn't truly a mirror, just polished black glass that reflected enough of the world to make you see yourself faintly, like a ghost version layered over the architecture. I stood there for several minutes. And in that dim reflection, I saw myself. But I also saw him, the boy who had been laughed at, the boy who had walked home alone from a party trying to understand why cruelty sounded like music to some people. The boy who had opened his laptop with fingers trembling from shame, not ambition. The boy who, despite it all, had decided to create. I realized then that this company had not just been my redemption, it had been my mirror. Every wall, every decision, every line of code I had written, every person I had hired, had slowly rebuilt my sense of self. And now, as I stood in the reflection of it all, the woman who had once fractured that self had become part of the architecture. Could I really let her in? Not physically, that had already happened, but emotionally, philosophically. Could I release the version of her I had stored in amber for so long? I returned to my office and opened her profile. Not her HR record, not her projects, but the internal feedback file she didn't know existed, notes submitted anonymously by peers, colleagues, team leads. Words about reliability, collaboration, creative insight. Phrases like level-headed, surprisingly empathetic. Never takes credit unnecessarily. One entry stood out. You wouldn't know she was new unless someone told you. She listens more than she talks. That last line struck me. Because the Vanessa I remembered, the girl from college, had always talked more than she listened. She had filled silence with noise, cloaked uncertainty with bravado, and mistook sharpness for strength. But this woman they were describing, she had learned the strength of silence. And maybe, just maybe, so had I. The next day we met again, in a smaller room with just 4 team members brainstorming content for the salvaged campaign. The crisis had softened slightly thanks to overnight pivots, but the pressure was still real. Vanessa sat across from me again. She offered feedback on tone and positioning, pushed gently against one proposed tagline, then stepped back to let the group debate. There was no ego in her posture, only intent. As I watched her, I felt a quiet sadness, not for her, not for myself, but for the years we had lost in assumptions. The labels we'd given each other, the ones we'd buried into our identities. She had called me a loser. I had labeled her a villain, but the truth, as always, was messier. We had both been young, insecure, and eager to survive. And now, years later, we were adults in the same room, trying to build something better than what we came from. After the meeting, I returned to my office, closed the door, and opened the journal I kept in my bottom drawer. I hadn't written in months, but that day I filled an entire page. I wrote about forgiveness, not as an act of absolution for others, but as an act of unburdening for myself. I wrote about reflection, how mirrors don't always show you the truth, but they show you what you're ready to see. And I wrote about her, not as the girl who once laughed, but as the woman who now quietly worked to repair something, even if she didn't know what it was. There's a peace that comes when the past no longer owns you. I didn't know yet if we'd ever talk about it. Maybe we wouldn't. Maybe the dignity of silence would serve us better than the clumsiness of apologies. Maybe some wounds don't need to be reopened to be healed. But I knew this. She was no longer my antagonist. And I was no longer the loser she once named. We were just two people in the middle of a life, trying not to repeat the mistakes that made us. And for now, that was enough. Some endings arrive not with grand closure, but in the quiet realization that nothing more needs to be said. There's a kind of liberation in that. For those who have carried pain too long, silence can be more healing than confrontation, more whole than apology. I had thought for years that vindication would come wrapped in words, in a moment where the scales would tip back in my favor, and I would finally reclaim the dignity that had once been taken from me. But now, I see things differently. The weeks that followed our joint project unfolded like pages with dog-eared corners, worn but worth returning to. The campaign we rebuilt was a success. The client who once threatened to pull their account ended up extending their contract. Internally, our team celebrated the win with cautious satisfaction, not fanfare. And among the emails, the progress decks, the end-of-week reports, her name continued to appear, calmly, consistently, never demanding attention, always offering value. I began to realize that she had found her own rhythm inside the company. She had made no attempt to cross the boundary between us, no gesture that sought to unpack the past, no clumsy attempt at acknowledgement. And strangely, I respected that. It wasn't cowardice. It was restraint. Perhaps she understood in her own way that some things do not belong in the light of language. In the quiet, I learned more about her than I ever had when her voice filled rooms. She was precise, not just in work but in conduct. She never interrupted others. She often took the least desirable tasks in meetings and executed them without complaint. She responded to feedback not defensively, but with an eagerness to refine. One of our newer hires told me that Vanessa had stayed late with her to help adjust a campaign brief, not because she was assigned to it, but because she noticed the other woman was overwhelmed. And as those stories accumulated, the memory of the party began to dissolve. Not disappear, not forgive itself, but dissolve like salt in water, still present but no longer visible, no longer burning on the tongue. One evening I stood alone in the open courtyard behind the building. The city pulsed quietly around me, its glass towers blinking under the night sky, its streets lit with the soft chaos of humanity. I looked up at our office windows, so many of them still glowing, so many lives entangled under the name I had once typed alone in a cramped studio apartment. I thought about the boy I had been, the one who walked home humiliated under a canopy of stars he never dared to claim. I wondered if she remembered. I wondered if, late at night, she thought about that word, loser, and if it stuck in her throat now the way it once stuck in mine. I wondered if she'd ever considered reaching out, or if she simply believed that showing up differently, day after day, was the only apology she knew how to offer. Maybe it was. And maybe that was enough. In time, her presence became normal, not because the past had been erased, but because it had been absorbed, like a scar no longer tender, just part of the skin. There came a day, months after her hiring, when she was promoted, not by me, by her department lead. It was a decision based on merit, supported by the executive board and celebrated by her team. I approved it without hesitation, not because I was gracious, but because I was honest. She had earned it. The news spread across our company's internal channel with polite congratulations. She responded with gratitude and a brief note of thanks. Her message was concise, professional, and characteristically modest. I stared at her post longer than I should have, not because it surprised me, but because, somewhere in that message, I felt the closing of a loop I hadn't realized was still open. The next day I passed her in the hallway. It wasn't the first time, but this time, for reasons I still don't fully understand, I slowed. She noticed, she met my gaze. And for one moment, we simply looked at each other, not with anger, not with guilt, but with a quiet recognition of the journey we had somehow taken together, though always at a distance. She gave a slight nod. It was not an apology. It was not a plea. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, offered like a leaf placed gently in a river. I returned it. Nothing more. And that was the first and last time we ever addressed what had happened. Not in words, not in confessions, but in the simple meeting of two people who had once wounded and been wounded, and who had chosen not to bleed on the floor of the present. I think about that often now. How growth is not always loud. How redemption doesn't always come in the form of dramatic gestures. Sometimes it arrives quietly in the way someone shows up to work, in the way they treat people when no one is watching, in the way they carry the weight of who they once were without asking the world to hold it for them. She never asked for forgiveness, but I gave it to her. Not for her sake, for mine. Because I realized, somewhere along the way, that carrying the label she gave me meant I had still given her power. Letting it go meant I had finally taken it back. Now when I walk through the company I built, I don't see her as a shadow anymore. I see her as a person, complex, flawed, capable of change. Like me. And when I think back to the moment she called me a loser, I no longer feel the sting. I feel the distance, the years that have passed, the lessons carved into the quiet. In the end, she was wrong. I wasn't a loser. I was just not yet found. And in finding myself, I became the kind of man who no longer needed her to be wrong in order for me to be whole. That's what healing is, I think. Not rewriting the past, but finally outgrowing it.